Hello again. I've been reading another book on racism written by a black person in Britain. Here it is. Why I'm no longer talking to white people about race. It is not a brilliant production, but to be fair to the author, she was only in her mid-20s when she wrote it, so we must make allowances for youth. Mind, after reading this and a couple of others, like Adam Rutherford's How to Argue with a Racist, I am sorely tempted to write a book of my own on the subject, called perhaps Why I'm No Longer Reading Books by Black People About Race. The book is really an expanded version of a blog post which Eddo-Lodge posted and which generated controversy. There is a difficulty here, which is that what works well enough in a short blog post doesn't necessarily translate well into a full-length book. There's also the fact that this book is both a personal perspective and a supposedly historical account of racism in Britain. Because it's written from a critical race theory perspective, though, this is quite permissible. The author's own experience of society is part of her lived experience and just as important as a load of facts and figures, which is fair enough. This brings us neatly, though, to the real problem. This is that the historical survey of racism is horribly inaccurate and full of elementary errors. I will be charitable and assume that this was accidental rather than a deliberate distortion of history. But when you're writing a book on such a sensitive topic as racism, it's irresponsible not to check that what you're saying is correct. Anyway, let's have a look at some of what is written here. Practically every page cries out for mention, but I'll limit myself to some of the worst parts just to give a flavour of the thing. We run into difficulties as early as page 2, which is a bit alarming. Although Eddo-Lodge makes such a fuss about the slave trade, she makes it clear that she doesn't really know anything about it. She describes how she visited Liverpool to investigate the history of slavery and its connection to the city, and then she writes the following. Liverpool had been Britain's biggest slave port. 1.5 million African people had passed through the city's ports. Okay, can anybody see a problem with that? Okay, she clearly doesn't know anything at all about the triangular trade, which is, I suppose, an indictment of the British educational system. Ships left Liverpool in the 18th century, carrying manufactured goods to West Africa, where they were exchanged for slaves. These were then transported across the Atlantic to America and the Caribbean, where they were in turn exchanged for commodities like cotton, sugar and tobacco. Those were then taken to Liverpool, where they were sold and the proceeds used to buy more manufactured goods, and so the trade began again. That's why it's called the triangular trade. The slaves didn't come within a couple of thousand miles of Liverpool. And to say that 1.5 million African people passed through the city's ports shows such an appalling ignorance of the author on the subject about which she has so much to say. Let's turn to page 14 now. Okay, she's talking about the riots in the summer of 1919. On 4th of June 1919, a Caribbean man was stabbed in the face by 2 white men after an argument over a cigarette. Numerous fights followed. The frenzy resulted in one of the most horrific race-hate crimes in British history. 24-year-old black seaman Charles Wooten was accosted by an enraged white crowd and thrown into the King's Dock. As he swam, desperately trying to lift himself out of the water, he was pelted with bricks until he sank under the surface. Sometime later, his lifeless body was dragged out of the dock. It was a public lynching. This story is complete fiction. In fact, there was fighting between Scandinavian and black sailors in Liverpool, and this culminated in a brawl outside a pub where knives and razors were used, chiefly by the black sailors. A policeman tried to intervene, whereupon he was knocked down and stabbed. This kind of thing really annoys the police. Reinforcements arrived, and the black sailors, who had been the ones mainly using knives, ran off to a lodging house. The police knocked on the door to try and get them to come down so that the injured policeman could see if he could identify any of them, whereupon somebody in an upper story began shooting at them with a revolver. Sergeant Getty was shot in the neck and PC Brown got a bullet in the mouth. One of those people up there, probably the one who was firing the revolver, was Charles Wooten, who then tried to escape from the back of the house. He was pursued by the police and also an angry crowd which had gathered. Nobody knows if he was pushed into the harbour or he tripped and fell. Since the police were trying to catch him, it's unlikely he was thrown in. If the crowd had caught him, they probably would have handed him over to the police. He certainly drowned, but this wasn't a lynching. By leaving out all mention of the shooting and the stabbing of the police officer, Eddo-Lodge has portrayed him as an innocent victim of racism. Here's a good one. In 1972, a violent and fatal street robbery in Handsworth, Birmingham, led to near constant press coverage of street robberies for the following year. Mugging was an American term imported from police statements and press coverage in black concentrated cities. The fear of mugging was imported too. The importation of the word mugging brought with it a coded implication that the perpetrators were overwhelmingly black. Yes, by emphasising the American nature of the expression mugging and claiming it was imported, the author of that book manages to tie it into race. But of course that's complete nonsense. In fact, mugging was an old English expression being used in London at least 100 years before, well, 110 years at least before the case which Eddo-Lodge mentions. How do we know this? By looking at the Old Bailey online, which anybody can do freely, and has digitised accounts of trials in the 19th century. I give a link above to the trial of Samuel Anderson for mugging in 1862. There had been a spate of what was known sometimes as garrotting, which is where two men ganged up on a passerby. One would grip the man round the throat, garrotting him, and then the other person, his accomplice, would go through the person's pockets and steal the watch and so on. Here's what William Good, Police Constable A523, said in evidence during this trial for mugging. He said that Anderson said to him, "You want me for putting the mug on, do you? I'll put the bloody mug on you." And then the police officer explains that mug is slang used by thieves. It means garrotting. Don't take my word for it. Have a look for yourselves. Did the author of Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race bother to find out whether mugging really was an American import, as she puts it? Or did she just make a wild guess? The next page has an account of Robert Ralph, a crank who went to prison in 1976 for putting his house on sale to a white family only. Some older people might remember that. He was a bit of a nutcase. We are told that the tabloid press, he went to prison by the way for contempt of court, the tabloid press used his imprisonment as ammunition to argue against what they called political correctness, in inverted commas. The tabloids didn't call this political correctness at all, because the expression didn't appear in Britain for at least another 15 years. Did the author bother to look at those tabloid newspapers and see what they actually said, or is she just inventing this? Anybody can join the British newspapers online archive, and she could have checked the accounts of Charles Wooten's death, she could have checked the accounts of mugging on the Old Bailey online, and she could have looked and seen what the tabloids were actually saying. By putting political correctness in brackets like that and suggesting that's what the tabloids were saying, she's claiming it as a direct quotation. It's not true. There's enough material in this book for a dozen videos, but I'm not sure I have the time or energy for such a project. What I find disturbing is this. I've looked in recent months at a few other books of this kind. For example, this one by Adam Rutherford, and of course Ali Rattanzi's book. They all have something in common, which is that they repeat the same false and inaccurate stories and give the same distorted and untruthful versions of historical events. The lynching of Charles Wooten, so-called, for instance, features in David Olusoga's book Black and British, which also became a bestseller. He too leaves out the shooting and stabbing of the police officers and also makes it look as though Charles Wooten was lynched for being black. I'm always ready to attribute errors of this kind to sloppy research rather than malicious intent, but Olusoga, for example, is an historian. When you're writing about racism, it's very important to make sure that you check that what you're saying is truthful and accurate. Otherwise, you can stir up hatred and cause trouble. There are two possibilities about all these books on racism which are written by black people. The first is that they're simply trying to make a few bob out of current concerns about racism, and so knock out poorly researched stuff which will appeal to the market and just copy what others have written on the subject. The other possibility would be that these people know very well that what they are writing is dangerous and untruthful nonsense, and that it's being done deliberately in order to provoke ill feeling between different ethnic communities. The first explanation would be understandable and suggest only greed and irresponsibility. The second would involve wicked and unprincipled behaviour. For what it's worth, my own money is on laziness and sloppiness rather than malice.